Question 1. Stakeholder feedback indicates that a real estate brokerage in Regina, Saskatchewan, has been involved in transactions where one agent within the brokerage represents the seller and another agent from the same brokerage represents the buyer. In such situations, what is the most appropriate and legally compliant course of action for the brokerage to ensure ethical representation and adherence to Saskatchewan's real estate regulations? Option A. The brokerage can proceed with the transaction as long as both the seller and the buyer are aware that agents from the same brokerage are involved, without requiring explicit written consent for dual agency. Option B. The brokerage can proceed with the transaction if the agent representing the buyer is not directly involved in listing the property, and the seller's agent handles all negotiations without explicit dual agency consent. Option C. The brokerage must obtain written consent from both the seller and the buyer, acknowledging the dual agency relationship before proceeding with the transaction, clearly outlining the implications for each party. Option D. The brokerage should assign different agents to represent the seller and the buyer, and if a dual agency situation arises, the brokerage should act as a neutral facilitator without formal disclosure of the dual agency. The correct answer is C. The brokerage must obtain written consent from both the seller and the buyer, acknowledging the dual agency relationship before proceeding with the transaction, clearly outlining the implications for each party. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a real estate professional to navigate potential conflicts of interest inherent in representing parties with opposing goals. Saskatchewan's real estate regulations, specifically those governing agency relationships and disclosure, demand a high degree of transparency and adherence to fiduciary duties. Careful judgment is required to ensure all parties are fully informed and that the professional's actions are ethical and legally compliant. The correct approach involves clearly defining the agency relationship from the outset and obtaining informed consent for any deviation from standard representation. This means that if a brokerage wishes to represent both the seller and the buyer in the same transaction, it must first disclose this intention to both parties. Both the seller and the buyer must then provide written consent to this dual agency arrangement. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with the principles of informed consent and the duty of loyalty and disclosure mandated by Saskatchewan's real estate legislation and professional conduct rules. It ensures that both parties understand the potential limitations on the agent's ability to advocate exclusively for their individual interests and allows them to make an informed decision about proceeding. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with representing both parties without obtaining explicit written consent for dual agency. This failure to disclose and obtain consent violates the fundamental principles of agency law and professional conduct in Saskatchewan. It breaches the duty of loyalty to both the seller and the buyer, as the agent cannot fully advocate for each party's best interests simultaneously. Another incorrect approach would be to implicitly assume consent by simply proceeding with the transaction once both parties are aware of the agent's involvement. This bypasses the crucial requirement for explicit, written acknowledgement and consent, leaving the professional vulnerable to ethical breaches and legal repercussions. Finally, attempting to act as a neutral facilitator without clearly establishing the agency relationship or obtaining consent for dual agency is also problematic. While neutrality might seem appealing, it does not absolve the professional of their disclosure obligations and the need for proper consent under Saskatchewan law. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes clear communication, thorough disclosure, and adherence to regulatory requirements. This involves proactively identifying potential conflicts of interest, understanding the implications of different agency models, and always obtaining written consent before engaging in any arrangement that could compromise fiduciary duties. When faced with a situation that could lead to dual agency, the professional must pause, review the relevant provisions of the Real Estate Act, Saskatchewan, and its associated regulations, and consult with their brokerage to ensure all disclosure and consent procedures are meticulously followed. Question 2. The evaluation methodology shows a real estate professional in Saskatchewan is tasked with valuing a niche commercial property that has a unique architectural design and a history of inconsistent rental income. Considering the specific market conditions and available data in Saskatchewan, which valuation method would best provide a defensible opinion of market value? Option A. The income approach, primarily relying on projected future rental income and a generalized capitalization rate derived from broader provincial commercial property data. Option B. The cost approach, estimating the current cost to replace the property and deducting an assumed percentage for physical and functional obsolescence. Option C, a modified comparative market analysis, focusing on the most similar recently sold commercial properties in the immediate vicinity and making detailed adjustments for the property's unique features and historical income fluctuations. Option D, a simplified comparative market analysis, using only properties that are architecturally similar, regardless of their location or recent sale dates. The correct answer is C, a modified comparative market analysis, focusing on the most similar recently sold commercial properties in the immediate vicinity and making detailed adjustments for the property's unique features and historical income fluctuations. Explanation: the evaluation methodology shows a scenario where a real estate professional in Saskatchewan must determine the most appropriate valuation method for a unique commercial property. This situation is professionally challenging because the property's characteristics may not perfectly align with the assumptions of any single valuation approach, requiring the professional to exercise sound judgment and adhere strictly to the Saskatchewan Real Estate Association (SREA) guidelines and the Real Estate Act of Saskatchewan. The professional must select the method that best reflects the property's market value, while remaining compliant with ethical and regulatory standards. The most appropriate approach in this scenario is the comparative market analysis, adapted for commercial properties. This method is correct because it directly addresses the principle of substitution, which is fundamental to real estate valuation. By analyzing recent sales of comparable commercial properties in the Saskatchewan market, adjusting for differences in features, location, and condition, and considering current market trends, this approach provides the most direct and relevant indication of what a buyer would likely pay. The SREA guidelines emphasize the importance of using the most reliable and current data available, and for a property with unique features, a well-executed comparative analysis, even with necessary adjustments, offers the most grounded market-based valuation. This aligns with the ethical obligation to provide clients with accurate and well-supported opinions of value. Using the income approach without sufficient comparable rental data or a clear understanding of market-derived capitalization rates would be an incorrect approach. While the income approach is vital for income-generating properties, its effectiveness relies heavily on accurate and verifiable income and expense data, as well as reliable market-derived capitalization rates. If these inputs are speculative or not well supported by the Saskatchewan market, the resulting valuation could be misleading and fail to meet the professional standard of care. This could lead to a breach of the Real Estate Act of Saskatchewan, which mandates competent and diligent service. Employing the cost approach as the primary method without strong justification would also be an incorrect approach. The cost approach is generally most reliable for newer construction or special-purpose properties, where depreciation is easier to estimate. For a commercial property that may have some age or unique functional obsolescence, accurately estimating depreciation can be highly subjective and difficult, leading to a less reliable valuation. Relying solely on the cost to replace the property, less depreciation, without considering what the market is actually paying for similar properties, can result in a valuation that does not reflect market reality, potentially misinforming the client and violating ethical duties. The professional reasoning process should involve first understanding the property's type and purpose. Then, the professional should assess the availability and reliability of data for each valuation approach within the specific Saskatchewan market. A preliminary analysis of comparable sales, income potential, and replacement costs should be conducted. The approach that yields the most reliable and defensible value, based on market evidence and regulatory guidelines, should be prioritized. In cases where a single approach is insufficient, a combination of methods, with a clear explanation of the weighting given to each, might be necessary, but the primary method should be the one most directly reflective of market behavior. Question 3. The efficiency study reveals that a real estate agent in Saskatchewan is assisting a buyer who expresses a strong desire for complete control over a property they intend to purchase, including the ability to sell it independently and pass it on to their heirs. The agent is considering how to best advise the buyer regarding the property's ownership structure, given that the seller's current title is complex. What is the most responsible and legally sound approach for the agent to take? Option A. Immediately draft an offer to purchase specifying that the buyer wishes to hold the property in fee simple, assuming this will grant them the desired complete control without further investigation into the seller's title or other ownership options. Option B. Thoroughly investigate the seller's current title to understand the existing form of ownership, and then clearly explain the implications of fee simple, leasehold, joint tenancy, and tenancy in common to the buyer, aligning the advice with the buyer's stated desire for control and inheritance. Option C. Focus on expediting the sale by assuring the buyer that their desire for complete control will be met through the standard purchase process, without delving into the specifics of different ownership types or the complexities of the seller's current title. Option D. Advise the buyer that complete control unequivocally means fee simple ownership and proceed with the transaction based on this assumption, without detailing other potential ownership structures or their implications. The correct answer is B. Thoroughly investigate the seller's current title to understand the existing form of ownership, and then clearly explain the implications of fee simple, leasehold, joint tenancy, and tenancy in common to the buyer, aligning the advice with the buyer's stated desire for control and inheritance. Explanation. The efficiency study reveals a potential conflict of interest and a misunderstanding of property ownership types within a Saskatchewan real estate transaction. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the agent to navigate complex ownership structures while upholding their fiduciary duties to clients and adhering to the Saskatchewan Real Estate Act and its associated regulations. A failure to correctly identify and advise on ownership types can lead to significant legal and financial repercussions for all parties involved, including the agent. The best professional approach involves clearly identifying the existing ownership structure of the property, and then advising the potential buyer on the implications of each ownership type in relation to their stated intentions for the property. This includes explaining the rights and responsibilities associated with fee simple, leasehold, joint tenancy, and tenancy in common, and how these might impact the buyer's ability to use, sell, or inherit the property. This approach aligns with the Saskatchewan Real Estate Act's requirement for agents to act with honesty, integrity, and in the best interests of their clients, ensuring informed decision-making. An incorrect approach would be to assume the buyer's desired ownership structure without verifying the current title. For instance, if the agent proceeds to draft an offer assuming the buyer wishes to hold the property as joint tenants, without confirming the seller's willingness or the legal feasibility of transferring title in that manner, it demonstrates a failure to conduct due diligence and potentially misrepresents the transaction status. This violates the duty to provide accurate information and can lead to a failed transaction or legal disputes. Another incorrect approach is to focus solely on the buyer's stated preference for full control and immediately suggest fee simple ownership without exploring if other forms of ownership, like joint tenancy with a spouse, might also satisfy this desire while offering other benefits. This oversimplification ignores the nuances of different ownership types and the specific needs of the buyer, potentially leading to an suboptimal or unintended ownership outcome. It also fails to fully educate the client on all available options and their implications. Finally, an approach that prioritizes closing the deal quickly by glossing over the details of the current title and the buyer's specific ownership goals is professionally unacceptable. This haste can lead to overlooking critical information about existing encumbrances or the seller's actual ownership rights, which could invalidate the transaction or create future liabilities. The professional reasoning process should always begin with a thorough understanding of the property's current legal status and the client's precise objectives, followed by clear, accurate, and comprehensive advice on how to achieve those objectives within the legal framework of Saskatchewan. Question 4. The evaluation methodology shows that a real estate licensee in Saskatchewan is advising a client who is interested in purchasing a property in a rural area and is seeking financing options that may offer more flexible terms. The licensee needs to determine the most appropriate guidance regarding government-backed loan programs. Which of the following represents the most effective and compliant approach for the licensee to take? Option A. Recommend that the client apply for a standard mortgage and then separately inquire with lenders about potential government incentives without providing specific program information. Option B. Advise the client that government-backed loans are generally not available for rural properties in Saskatchewan and suggest they focus on conventional mortgage products. Option C. Inform the client that U.S. federal programs such as FHA, VA, and USDA loans are excellent options for rural properties and encourage them to explore these avenues for financing. Option D. Research and advise the client on any Saskatchewan provincial programs that support rural property acquisition or offer flexible financing, and investigate if any federal Canadian programs align with the client's needs, while clarifying that U.S. federal programs like FHA, VA, and USDA are not directly applicable in Canada. The correct answer is D. Research and advise the client on any Saskatchewan provincial programs that support rural property acquisition or offer flexible financing, and investigate if any federal Canadian programs align with the client's needs, while clarifying that U.S. federal programs like FHA, VA, and USDA are not directly applicable in Canada. Explanation. The evaluation methodology shows that understanding the nuances of government-backed loan programs is crucial for real estate professionals in Saskatchewan. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a licensee to navigate complex eligibility criteria and program guidelines while acting in the best interest of their client, potentially influencing their access to financing. Misinterpreting or misapplying these guidelines can lead to significant financial repercussions for the buyer and professional liability for the licensee. The best approach involves a thorough understanding of the Saskatchewan government's specific initiatives and federal programs that may be applicable within the province. This includes recognizing that while FHA, VA, and USDA loans are primarily U.S. federal programs, Saskatchewan may have provincial programs or partnerships that mirror similar objectives, such as supporting first-time homebuyers or rural development. A licensee must proactively research and understand these provincial programs and how they interact with any available federal programs that might extend to Canadian residents or specific property types within Saskatchewan. This ensures the client receives accurate, relevant, and actionable advice tailored to their situation and the local market. An incorrect approach would be to assume that U.S. federal programs like FHA, VA, or USDA are directly applicable in Saskatchewan without any provincial adaptation or specific agreement. This is a regulatory failure because these programs are designed for the U.S. housing market and its specific regulatory framework. Applying them directly to a Saskatchewan context would be misleading and could lead a client to pursue financing options that are not available or legally permissible in Canada. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on general knowledge of mortgage products without investigating specific government-backed initiatives available in Saskatchewan. This overlooks the unique benefits and eligibility requirements of such programs, potentially causing a client to miss out on more favorable financing terms or to be disqualified from programs they might otherwise qualify for. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to provide comprehensive advice. Finally, an incorrect approach is to advise a client that government-backed loans are universally accessible without verifying their applicability to the specific property and the client's circumstances within Saskatchewan. This is a misrepresentation of available financing options and a failure to adhere to the principle of providing accurate and specific advice. Professionals should adopt a decision-making process that prioritizes client education and thorough research. This involves first understanding the client's financial situation and goals, then diligently investigating all available financing options, with a particular focus on any government-backed programs or incentives relevant to Saskatchewan. This research should include consulting official provincial government resources and reputable mortgage brokers specializing in Canadian financing. The licensee's role is to facilitate informed decision-making by presenting accurate and relevant information, not to make assumptions about program applicability. Question 5. Strategic planning requires a real estate professional in Saskatchewan to assess the enforceability of a listing agreement when a seller expresses significant distress and mentions feeling pressured by a family member to sell their property quickly at below market price. Which of the following actions best upholds professional and legal obligations? Option A. Proceed with listing the property as instructed, assuming the seller is aware of their actions and the market value, and document the seller's verbal confirmation of their decision. Option B. Inform the seller that as their agent, you have assessed the situation and believe they have the capacity to sign, and proceed with the listing based on your professional judgment. Option C. Encourage the seller to sign the listing agreement quickly to secure the sale before the family member changes their mind. Emphasizing the urgency of the situation, Option D. Advise the seller to immediately consult with an independent real estate lawyer to discuss their rights and the implications of the listing agreement, and pause all marketing activities until legal counsel is obtained. Correct answer is D. Advise the seller to immediately consult with an independent real estate lawyer to discuss their rights and the implications of the listing agreement, and pause all marketing activities until legal counsel is obtained. Explanation. Strategic planning requires careful consideration of real estate contract enforceability, especially when dealing with unique circumstances that might affect a party's capacity to enter into a binding agreement. In Saskatchewan, the enforceability of a real estate contract hinges on several key elements, including the offer, acceptance, consideration, and the legal capacity of the parties involved. A scenario where a seller appears to be under duress or exhibiting signs of diminished mental capacity presents a significant professional challenge. Real estate professionals must navigate this situation with utmost diligence to protect all parties and uphold ethical and legal standards. The best approach involves immediately pausing the transaction and advising the seller to seek independent legal counsel. This is correct because the Saskatchewan Real Estate Act and its associated regulations, along with general contract law principles, mandate that parties must have the legal capacity to understand the nature and consequences of the agreement they are entering into. If a party lacks capacity due to duress, undue influence, or mental impairment, the contract may be voidable. By recommending legal advice, the agent ensures the seller's rights are protected and that any subsequent agreement is entered into voluntarily and with full understanding. This aligns with the fiduciary duty agents owe to their clients and the broader professional obligation to ensure fair and lawful transactions. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the transaction, assuming the seller understands the terms and is acting freely. This fails to acknowledge the potential for a lack of capacity, which could render the contract unenforceable and expose the agent to liability. It violates the principle of acting in the client's best interest and could lead to significant legal disputes. Another incorrect approach would be to pressure the seller to sign quickly, perhaps by downplaying their concerns or suggesting that delaying the sale will result in financial loss. This constitutes undue influence and directly contradicts the requirement for voluntary consent. It is ethically reprehensible and legally unsound, as it exploits a potentially vulnerable party. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to unilaterally decide the seller has capacity and proceed without any further verification or advice. This oversteps the agent's role and ignores the serious implications of potential incapacity. Agents are facilitators, not legal determiners of capacity, and their duty is to ensure proper legal processes are followed when such doubts arise. The professional reasoning process in such a situation should involve 1. Recognizing red flags indicating potential lack of capacity or duress. 2. Immediately halting the transaction process. 3. Strongly advising the client to seek independent legal counsel. 4. Documenting all interactions and advice given. 5. Refraining from making legal judgments about capacity. Question 6. The control framework reveals that a real estate agent in Regina, Saskatchewan, is representing a buyer interested in a property that the seller claims has always been used as a small, home-based craft business. The buyer wishes to continue this business and potentially expand it to include retail sales on-site. What is the most prudent and legally compliant course of action for the agent to ensure the buyer's plans align with local land use regulations? Option A. Recommend that the buyer proceed with their retail sales plans and obtain any necessary permits only after the sale is finalized, assuming the municipality will approve the change based on the property's past use. Option B. Directly contact the City of Regina's Planning and Development Department to confirm the current zoning designation of the property and inquire about the specific bylaws and permit requirements for home-based businesses and on-site retail sales. Option C. Rely on the seller's verbal assurance that the property has historically been used for craft business and assume that this use will be permitted to continue. Option D. Advise the buyer that since the property has been used as a home-based craft business, it is likely zoned appropriately, and they can proceed with their expansion plans without further investigation. Correct answer is B. Directly contact the City of Regina's Planning and Development Department to confirm the current zoning designation of the property and inquire about the specific bylaws and permit requirements for home-based businesses and on-site retail sales. Explanation. The control framework reveals that navigating zoning bylaws in Saskatchewan requires a meticulous understanding of local municipal authority and its impact on property development. This scenario is professionally challenging because a real estate agent must balance their client's desires with the legal constraints imposed by the municipality, ensuring all actions are compliant and ethically sound. Misinterpreting or ignoring zoning regulations can lead to significant legal repercussions for both the agent and the client, including fines, development delays, and potential litigation. The best professional approach involves proactively verifying the current zoning designation and any applicable land use restrictions directly with the relevant Saskatchewan municipality. This approach is correct because the Saskatchewan Planning and Development Act, 1983, grants municipalities the authority to enact zoning bylaws and development permits. By consulting the official municipal planning department, the agent ensures they are working with the most accurate and up-to-date information regarding permitted uses, setbacks, density, and other land use controls. This diligence protects the client's investment and upholds the agent's professional duty of care and compliance with provincial and municipal legislation. An approach that relies solely on the seller's verbal assurances about the property's zoning is professionally unacceptable. This fails to meet the standard of care expected of a real estate professional and directly contravenes the principle of due diligence. Municipal bylaws are legally binding documents, and verbal statements, while potentially well-intentioned, are not a substitute for official confirmation. This could lead to a client purchasing a property with the expectation of a certain use that is, in fact, prohibited by zoning, resulting in financial loss and potential legal disputes. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to assume that a property's historical use automatically dictates its current zoning permissibility. While historical use can sometimes inform zoning considerations, it does not override current bylaws. Municipalities can and do change zoning regulations over time, and a property's past use does not grant it immunity from these changes. Proceeding without verifying current zoning based on past use is a significant ethical and legal failing. Finally, an approach that involves advising the client to proceed with development plans without obtaining a development permit from the municipality is also professionally unsound. The Saskatchewan Planning and Development Act, 1983, mandates that development permits are required for most construction or land use changes. Bypassing this requirement demonstrates a disregard for the regulatory process and exposes the client to penalties and the potential for having to undo unauthorized work. The professional reasoning framework for such situations should involve a systematic process. 1. Identify the client's objectives and any potential land use implications. 2. Recognize the governing authority, in this case, the Saskatchewan municipality, and the relevant legislation, Saskatchewan Planning and Development Act, 1983. 3. Proactively seek official confirmation of zoning and land use regulations from the municipal planning department. 4. Clearly communicate all findings and potential restrictions to the client. 5. Advise the client on the necessary steps for compliance, including obtaining permits. Question 7. The control framework reveals that a real estate licensee in Saskatchewan is presenting a multi-unit residential property for investment to a client. The licensee has received preliminary financial projections from the seller indicating a strong potential for high rental income and capital appreciation. However, the licensee has not yet independently verified the accuracy of these projections, nor has the licensee investigated the current condition of the building's major systems, e.g., HVAC, roofing, or the local rental vacancy rates, which approach best demonstrates professional responsibility and adherence to Saskatchewan's real estate regulations when advising the client on this potential investment. Option A. Present the seller's financial projections to the client without independent verification and encourage a swift decision to secure the investment before market conditions change. Option B. Immediately recommend the client purchase the property, highlighting the strong rental income potential and downplaying any need for further investigation, as the seller's figures appear promising. Option C. Advise the client to proceed with the purchase, focusing on the potential for capital appreciation, and suggesting that the client can address any property maintenance issues after closing. Option D. Advise the client to proceed with the purchase, emphasizing the seller's optimistic financial projections and the potential for significant returns, while recommending they conduct their own independent verification of all details. The correct answer is D. Advise the client to proceed with the purchase, emphasizing the seller's optimistic financial projections and the potential for significant returns, while recommending they conduct their own independent verification of all details. Explanation. The control framework reveals that real estate investment analysis in Saskatchewan requires a nuanced approach that balances financial viability with ethical conduct and regulatory compliance. This scenario is professionally challenging because it presents a situation where a potentially lucrative investment opportunity might be obscured by incomplete or misleading information, and where the licensee's duty to their client conflicts with the desire to secure a profitable deal. Careful judgment is required to ensure that all decisions are made in the best interest of the client and in accordance with the Real Estate Act, Saskatchewan, and its associated regulations. The best professional practice involves a comprehensive due diligence process that prioritizes the client's financial well-being and informed decision-making. This approach entails thoroughly investigating all aspects of the investment, including market conditions, property condition, potential returns, and associated risks, and presenting this information transparently to the client. It requires the licensee to act with honesty, integrity, and in a fiduciary capacity, ensuring that the client fully understands the implications of the investment before committing. This aligns with the ethical obligations under the Real Estate Act, Saskatchewan, to act in the client's best interest and to provide competent service. An approach that focuses solely on the potential for high rental yields without a thorough examination of the property's structural integrity or the local rental market's stability is professionally unacceptable. This failure to conduct adequate due diligence can lead to significant financial losses for the client and breaches the licensee's duty of care. It also contravenes the principles of honest and fair dealing expected of real estate professionals in Saskatchewan. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to downplay or omit any potential negative aspects of the investment, such as upcoming special assessments or a declining neighborhood, in an effort to expedite the sale. This misrepresentation or omission of material facts violates the licensee's obligation to provide accurate and complete information, undermining the client's ability to make an informed decision and potentially exposing the licensee to disciplinary action under the Real Estate Act, Saskatchewan. Furthermore, an approach that prioritizes securing the commission over the client's best interests, perhaps by pressuring the client to make a quick decision without adequate time for review or consultation with other professionals, is unethical and illegal. This conduct directly contradicts the fiduciary duty owed to the client and the requirement to act with integrity. The professional reasoning framework for similar situations should involve a systematic evaluation of the investment opportunity through the lens of the client's objectives and risk tolerance. This includes 1. Understanding the client's investment goals, 2. Conducting exhaustive due diligence, including independent verification of all financial projections and property assessments, 3. Transparently communicating all findings, both positive and negative, to the client, 4. Advising the client to seek independent professional advice, e.g., from a lawyer or accountant when necessary, 5. Ensuring all documentation is accurate and complete, 6. Acting with utmost good faith and in the client's best interest at all times, in strict adherence to the Real Estate Act, Saskatchewan. Question 8. System analysis indicates that a property manager in Saskatchewan has received a tenant request for a repair that is necessary for the habitability of the unit, but the landlord has expressed concern about immediate cash flow and prefers to delay the repair. Which course of action best upholds the property manager's professional and legal obligations? Option A. Advise the tenant that the repair is not a priority and can be addressed at a later date, without further investigation into its necessity. Option B. Defer the repair until the landlord's financial situation improves, prioritizing the landlord's immediate cash flow concerns over the tenant's habitability request. Option C. Arrange for the necessary repair to be completed promptly, while simultaneously informing the landlord of the legal requirement to maintain the property and the potential consequences of delay. Option D. Proceed with the repair immediately, without fully informing the landlord of the legal justification and potential costs, assuming the landlord will approve it later. The correct answer is C. Arrange for the necessary repair to be completed promptly, while simultaneously informing the landlord of the legal requirement to maintain the property and the potential consequences of delay. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a property manager in Saskatchewan to balance the immediate financial needs of a landlord with the long-term habitability and legal obligations of the property. The tenant's request, while potentially inconvenient for the landlord's immediate cash flow, addresses a fundamental issue of property maintenance that, if ignored, could lead to more significant problems and potential legal repercussions under Saskatchewan's residential tenancy laws. The property manager must navigate these competing interests ethically and within the bounds of their professional responsibilities and the relevant legislation. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves prioritizing the tenant's request for essential repairs and communicating transparently with the landlord about the necessity and implications of these repairs. This approach aligns with the Residential Tenancies Act, 2006, Saskatchewan, which mandates that landlords maintain rental units in a good state of repair. A property manager's duty includes ensuring compliance with these legal obligations. By addressing the repair promptly and informing the landlord of the legal and practical reasons for doing so, the property manager upholds their fiduciary duty to the landlord, while also fulfilling their statutory obligations to the tenant and the property itself. This proactive stance prevents potential disputes, further damage, and legal action. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves deferring the repair to address the landlord's immediate cash flow concerns. This fails to acknowledge the landlord's legal obligation to maintain the property in a habitable condition as stipulated by the Residential Tenancies Act, 2006, Saskatchewan. Delaying essential repairs can exacerbate the problem, leading to greater costs and potential tenant complaints or legal action, which ultimately harms the landlord's interests. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the tenant's request without proper investigation, assuming it is not urgent. This disregards the tenant's right to a safe and habitable living environment, and the property manager's responsibility to assess and address maintenance issues. Such an approach could violate the landlord's obligations under Saskatchewan tenancy law and damage the professional reputation of the property manager. A third incorrect approach is to proceed with the repair without adequately informing the landlord of the necessity and potential costs, especially if the landlord is resistant due to financial reasons. While addressing the repair is crucial, failing to communicate effectively with the landlord about the legal basis and financial implications can lead to mistrust and disputes, undermining the professional relationship and potentially violating the property management agreement. Professional reasoning. Property managers should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the core issue, tenant's repair request. Next, they must consult the relevant legal framework, specifically the Residential Tenancies Act, 2006, Saskatchewan, to understand the landlord's obligations regarding property maintenance and habitability. Simultaneously, they should assess the urgency and nature of the repair. The manager should then communicate clearly and professionally with both the tenant, acknowledging the request and outlining next steps, and the landlord, explaining the legal requirements, the nature of the repair, and the recommended course of action, including cost estimates. The decision should prioritize legal compliance and the long-term well-being of the property and tenant, while also managing the landlord's financial expectations through transparent communication and proactive problem-solving. Question 9. The monitoring system demonstrates that a real estate professional in Saskatchewan is advising a client on the purchase of property. Which of the following best reflects the comprehensive definition of real estate that the professional must consider to ensure full client disclosure and adherence to provincial regulations? Option A. A commodity whose value is determined solely by market demand and supply. Option B. Land. All permanent natural and man-made attachments, and all rights and interests legally associated with the land. Option C. A concept whose definition is consistent across all Canadian provinces and territories. Option D. Only the physical land and any buildings or structures erected on it. The correct answer is B. Land. All permanent natural and man-made attachments, and all rights and interests legally associated with the land. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a real estate professional in Saskatchewan to navigate the fundamental definition of real estate and its implications for client representation and property transactions, without resorting to simplistic or incomplete understandings. The core of the challenge lies in accurately identifying what constitutes real estate under Saskatchewan law and how this definition impacts the scope of services and advice provided to clients. The correct approach involves a comprehensive understanding that real estate in Saskatchewan encompasses not only the land itself, but also all permanent, natural, and man-made attachments. This includes buildings, structures, and even certain rights and interests associated with the land, such as easements or mineral rights, as defined by the Land Titles Act and common law principles. A professional must recognize that this broad definition dictates the scope of their fiduciary duties and the advice they can offer regarding property value, potential encumbrances, and the legal aspects of a transaction. This understanding is crucial for fulfilling obligations under the Real Estate Profession Act and its associated regulations, ensuring clients are fully informed about what they are buying or selling. An incorrect approach would be to narrowly define real estate solely as the physical land and any structures upon it, ignoring associated rights or interests. This oversight could lead to misrepresentation or incomplete advice, failing to address potential issues like subsurface mineral rights or existing easements that significantly impact a property's use and value. Such a limited perspective violates the duty of care owed to clients and contravenes the professional standards expected under Saskatchewan's real estate legislation, which mandates thoroughness and accuracy in all dealings. Another incorrect approach is to consider real estate as merely a commodity to be traded, without acknowledging the legal and physical complexities inherent in its definition. This transactional mindset overlooks the importance of understanding the unique characteristics of each property, including its legal description, zoning, and any potential limitations or benefits derived from its association with other rights or parcels. This failure to appreciate the multifaceted nature of real estate can result in clients making uninformed decisions, potentially leading to disputes and professional liability. Finally, an incorrect approach involves assuming that the definition of real estate is static and universally understood across all contexts, without considering how provincial legislation and common law specifically define it in Saskatchewan. Real estate law is jurisdiction-specific, and relying on general knowledge or definitions from other regions would be a significant professional failing. Professionals must adhere to the specific legal framework of Saskatchewan to ensure compliance and provide accurate, relevant advice. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should begin with a thorough review of the relevant provincial legislation and common law definitions pertaining to real estate. This should be followed by an assessment of how these definitions impact the specific property and transaction at hand, considering all potential attachments, rights, and interests. Professionals must then apply this understanding to their client interactions, ensuring clear, accurate, and comprehensive advice that aligns with their fiduciary duties and regulatory obligations in Saskatchewan. Question 10. Benchmark analysis indicates that a buyer in Regina, Saskatchewan, is pre-approved for a mortgage, but the lender requires a formal property appraisal to confirm the loan-to-value ratio. The buyer is concerned that a professional appraisal might come in lower than their offer price, potentially jeopardizing the financing. As a real estate agent, what is the most appropriate course of action to ensure compliance with Saskatchewan's real estate regulations and ethical standards? Option A. Advise the buyer to obtain a professional appraisal from a licensed appraiser to provide an objective valuation for the lender. Option B. Instruct the buyer to omit any known property defects from the mortgage application to avoid impacting the appraisal value. Option C. Prepare an inflated comparative market analysis, CMA, that supports the buyer's offer price to present to the lender. Option D. Suggest the buyer explore private lending options that may have more flexible valuation criteria. The correct answer is A. Advise the buyer to obtain a professional appraisal from a licensed appraiser to provide an objective valuation for the lender. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a real estate agent in Saskatchewan to balance the client's desire for a quick sale with the lender's stringent underwriting requirements. The agent must ensure that the property's valuation accurately reflects its market value to avoid misrepresenting the property to the lender, which could have serious legal and ethical repercussions. Failure to do so can lead to a failed transaction, financial loss for the client, and potential disciplinary action against the agent. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves obtaining a professional appraisal from a licensed appraiser. This approach is correct because it aligns with the Saskatchewan Real Estate Association, SREA, Code of Ethics, and the Saskatchewan Real Estate Act. The Act mandates that registrants must not misrepresent the value of a property. A professional appraisal provides an objective, independent, and legally defensible valuation, which is the standard expected by lenders for underwriting purposes. This ensures that the loan amount is based on a realistic assessment of the property's worth, protecting both the buyer and the lender. Incorrect approach is analysis, providing a comparative market analysis, CMA, that is intentionally inflated to meet the buyer's desired loan-to-value ratio is ethically unsound and violates the SREA Code of Ethics, specifically the duty to be honest and truthful. While a CMA is a tool for pricing, it is not a formal valuation and should not be presented as such to a lender. Misrepresenting the property's value to facilitate a sale is a breach of trust and can lead to accusations of fraud. Suggesting the buyer seek a private lender, who may have less stringent valuation requirements, bypasses the standard, regulated lending process. This approach fails to uphold the agent's duty to act in the best interest of their client within legal and ethical boundaries. It also exposes the buyer to potentially predatory lending practices and higher risks, which an agent should actively help them avoid. Advising the buyer to omit certain property defects from the mortgage application is a direct violation of disclosure requirements and can be considered fraudulent. Lenders rely on complete and accurate information to assess risk. Concealing material facts about the property's condition can lead to loan default and significant legal consequences for all parties involved, including the real estate agent. Professional reasoning. Professionals should always prioritize accuracy, transparency, and adherence to regulatory requirements. When faced with a situation where a client's expectations conflict with lender requirements, the professional's duty is to educate the client about the process and guide them towards legitimate solutions. This involves understanding the role of professional appraisals in loan underwriting and ensuring all disclosures are complete and truthful. The decision-making framework should involve 1. Identifying the core conflict client desire vs. lender requirement. 2. Consulting relevant regulations and ethical codes, Saskatchewan Real Estate Act, SREA Code of Ethics. 3. Recommending the most compliant and ethical solution, professional appraisal. 4. Educating the client on the rationale and implications of the chosen approach. Question 11. The performance metrics show a consistent increase in interest rates over the past year in Saskatchewan. A prospective buyer who has a stable income but is concerned about immediate affordability is exploring mortgage options. Which approach best advises this buyer on selecting a mortgage type, considering the current economic climate and their stated concerns? Option A. Recommend an interest-only mortgage, emphasizing the reduced initial monthly payments and suggesting the buyer can refinance or sell before principal repayment begins. Option B. Strongly advocate for an adjustable-rate mortgage, highlighting its potentially lower initial interest rate and monthly payments as the primary solution for immediate affordability concerns. Option C. Focus solely on the mortgage option with the absolute lowest initial monthly payment, regardless of its long-term implications or the buyer's risk tolerance. Option D. Thoroughly explain the benefits of a fixed-rate mortgage in providing payment stability and predictability against rising interest rates, while also discussing the potential for higher initial payments compared to other options. The correct answer is D. Thoroughly explain the benefits of a fixed-rate mortgage in providing payment stability and predictability against rising interest rates, while also discussing the potential for higher initial payments compared to other options. Explanation. The performance metrics show a consistent increase in interest rates over the past year in Saskatchewan. This economic trend presents a professional challenge for real estate agents advising clients on mortgage choices, as it directly impacts the affordability and long-term cost of homeownership. Careful judgment is required to ensure clients make informed decisions aligned with their financial capacity and risk tolerance, adhering to the ethical obligations of disclosure and client best interests under Saskatchewan real estate regulations. The best professional approach involves thoroughly explaining the implications of a fixed-rate mortgage in the current rising interest rate environment. This means detailing how a fixed-rate mortgage offers payment stability and predictability, shielding the borrower from potential increases in monthly payments that are characteristic of an adjustable-rate mortgage. It also involves contrasting this stability with the potential for lower initial payments of an interest-only mortgage, highlighting the significant risk of payment shock when principal repayment begins, and the lack of equity buildup during the interest-only period. This approach prioritizes client understanding of long-term financial security and risk mitigation, aligning with the Saskatchewan Real Estate Act's requirement for agents to act with honesty, integrity, and in the best interests of their clients. An approach that solely recommends an adjustable rate mortgage, emphasizing its potentially lower initial interest rate, fails to adequately address the significant risk of future payment increases in a rising rate environment. This oversight could lead to a client being unable to afford their mortgage payments down the line, violating the duty to ensure clients understand the full implications of their financial commitments. Recommending an interest-only mortgage without a comprehensive discussion of the risks associated with deferred principal repayment and the potential for substantial payment increases when the interest-only period ends is also professionally unsound. This approach neglects to inform the client about the lack of equity accumulation during the initial phase, which is a critical component of homeownership and financial planning. Such a recommendation could be seen as prioritizing a quick sale over the client's long-term financial well-being, contravening ethical standards, focusing exclusively on the lowest initial monthly payment, without a full disclosure of the associated risks and long-term costs of any mortgage type, is a failure to provide adequate advice. Professional reasoning in such situations requires a client-centric approach. First, understanding the client's financial situation, risk tolerance, and long-term goals. Second, clearly explaining the features, benefits, and risks of all relevant mortgage types, including fixed rate, adjustable rate, and interest-only options, within the context of current market conditions. And third, empowering the client to make an informed decision based on comprehensive and unbiased information. Question 12. The performance metrics show a consistent pattern of inquiries regarding properties with existing easements. A seller in Regina, Saskatchewan, instructs their real estate agent not to mention a registered utility easement that crosses a portion of their property, stating it has been there for years and has never caused an issue. The agent believes the easement is indeed minor and unlikely to impact most buyers. What is the most appropriate course of action for the real estate agent in Saskatchewan? Option A. Advise potential buyers that there may be minor encumbrances on the property without specifying the easement, allowing them to conduct their own due diligence. Option B. Comply with the seller's instruction and refrain from mentioning the easement, as it has not caused issues in the past and the seller deems it insignificant. Option C. Proactively disclose the existence of the registered utility easement to all potential buyers and their representatives, providing details of its nature and location on the property. Option D. Inform potential buyers that the seller has indicated there are no significant issues with the property, implying the easement is not a material fact. Correct answer is C. Proactively disclose the existence of the registered utility easement to all potential buyers and their representatives, providing details of its nature and location on the property. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a real estate professional to navigate potential conflicts of interest and ensure full disclosure of material facts to all parties involved, adhering strictly to Saskatchewan's real estate regulations and ethical standards. The core issue is balancing the client's desire for privacy with the legal and ethical obligations to disclose information that could impact a buyer's decision. Careful judgment is required to avoid misrepresentation or withholding crucial information. The best professional practice involves proactively identifying and disclosing the existence of the easement to potential buyers and their representatives. This approach aligns with the Saskatchewan Real Estate Act and its associated regulations, which mandate the disclosure of all material facts that could affect the value or desirability of a property. By informing all parties, the professional upholds their duty of honesty and fairness, allowing buyers to make informed decisions and preventing future disputes or legal challenges. This transparency also protects the seller by ensuring they are not seen as having misrepresented the property. Failing to disclose the easement to potential buyers, even if the seller instructs otherwise, constitutes a serious breach of professional conduct and regulatory requirements. This approach misleads buyers about the true nature of the property rights they are acquiring, potentially leading to significant financial and legal repercussions for the buyer and reputational damage for the professional. It violates the principle of full disclosure and could be considered misrepresentation under Saskatchewan law. Another unacceptable approach is to vaguely allude to potential encumbrances without providing specific details about the easement. This is insufficient disclosure as it does not equip buyers with the necessary information to understand the implications of the easement on their intended use of the property. It creates ambiguity and does not meet the standard of providing material facts, leaving buyers vulnerable to making decisions based on incomplete information. Finally, relying solely on the seller's assurance that the easement is minor and not worth mentioning is a dereliction of the professional's independent duty. While a seller's input is important, the real estate professional has a legal and ethical obligation to verify and disclose all material facts, regardless of the seller's opinion on their significance. This approach outsources the professional's responsibility and can lead to the withholding of critical information. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes transparency and compliance. This involves thoroughly investigating all aspects of a property, including any registered encumbrances, and proactively disclosing all material facts to all parties. When in doubt about the materiality of a fact, it is always best practice to disclose it. This approach safeguards all parties, upholds the integrity of the profession, and ensures compliance with Saskatchewan's real estate laws and ethical codes. Question 13. The performance metrics show a consistent trend of properties with a history of industrial use taking longer to sell in Saskatchewan. A real estate agent is representing a seller whose property was formerly the site of a small manufacturing plant. The seller is eager for a quick sale and has not disclosed any specific environmental concerns. What is the most responsible course of action for the agent to recommend to the seller to ensure a smooth and legally compliant transaction? Option A. Advise the seller to engage a qualified environmental consultant to conduct a Phase I environmental site assessment, ESSA, to identify any potential or existing environmental contamination and to disclose the findings to potential buyers. Option B. Advise the seller to wait for a potential buyer to inquire about the property's environmental history before taking any action. Option C. Recommend that the seller simply not mention the property's past industrial use to potential buyers, as it may deter interest. Option D. Suggest the agent conduct their own research into the property's environmental history using publicly available online resources before listing. The correct answer is A. Advise the seller to engage a qualified environmental consultant to conduct a Phase I environmental site assessment, ESSA, to identify any potential or existing environmental contamination and to disclose the findings to potential buyers. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a real estate professional in Saskatchewan to navigate potential environmental liabilities that could significantly impact a property's value and marketability. The challenge lies in balancing the client's desire for a swift sale with the legal and ethical obligations to disclose known environmental concerns and ensure compliance with Saskatchewan's environmental protection legislation. Failure to do so can lead to legal repercussions, financial penalties, and damage to professional reputation. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves proactively identifying and disclosing potential environmental issues. This approach requires the agent to advise their client to obtain a Phase I environmental site assessment, ESSA, from a qualified environmental consultant. This assessment will identify potential or existing environmental contamination and provide recommendations for further investigation or remediation. By recommending this step, the agent fulfills their duty of care to the client and potential buyers, ensuring transparency and compliance with Saskatchewan's environmental regulations, such as those under the Environmental Management and Protection Act, 2010. This proactive disclosure allows for informed decision-making by all parties and mitigates future liability. Incorrect approaches analysis. Recommending that the seller simply not mention any past industrial use of the property is ethically and legally unsound. This approach constitutes a failure to disclose material latent defects, which is a breach of the agent's fiduciary duty to the buyer and violates principles of honest and fair dealing. It also contravenes Saskatchewan's real estate practice regulations, which mandate disclosure of known material facts. Suggesting that the agent personally research the property's environmental history through publicly available records without engaging a qualified professional is insufficient. While due diligence is important, an agent's research is not a substitute for a formal environmental assessment. This approach risks overlooking critical information and could lead to misrepresentation or omission of significant environmental concerns, failing to meet the standards required by environmental legislation and professional conduct rules. Advising the seller to wait for a buyer to raise concerns about potential environmental issues before taking any action is a passive and irresponsible approach. This strategy places the burden of discovery on the buyer and fails to uphold the agent's obligation to facilitate a transparent transaction. It also increases the risk of the transaction falling apart later due to undisclosed environmental problems, potentially leading to disputes and legal action against the agent. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a proactive and transparent approach to environmental due diligence. This involves understanding the potential environmental risks associated with a property, advising clients on necessary assessments, and ensuring full disclosure of all known material facts, including environmental concerns, in accordance with Saskatchewan's real estate legislation and environmental protection laws. Question 14. The assessment process reveals that a real estate agent in Saskatchewan is working with a client who is seeking to purchase a condominium. The client explicitly states, "I don't want to live in a building with too many young families or single parents. I prefer a quieter environment with mostly older, established residents." Considering the Saskatchewan Human Rights Code, which of the following represents the most appropriate and legally compliant course of action for the real estate agent? Option A. Politely inform the client that the agent cannot accommodate their request as it may lead to discriminatory practices, and explain that the Saskatchewan Human Rights Code prohibits discrimination in housing based on family status and other protected grounds. Option B. Decline to work with the client immediately without further explanation, citing a conflict of interest. Option C. Agree to the client's request and focus the property search on condominiums known to have a higher proportion of older residents, without mentioning the discriminatory nature of the request. Option D. Proceed with showing the client a variety of condominiums, including those with young families, but subtly avoid highlighting amenities or features that might appeal to families. The correct answer is A. Politely inform the client that the agent cannot accommodate their request as it may lead to discriminatory practices, and explain that the Saskatchewan Human Rights Code prohibits discrimination in housing based on family status and other protected grounds. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because real estate professionals in Saskatchewan must navigate client requests that may inadvertently lead to discriminatory practices. The challenge lies in balancing a client's stated preferences with the legal and ethical obligations to provide services without discrimination. Failing to recognize and address potential discrimination can result in significant legal penalties and damage to professional reputation. Careful judgment is required to identify subtle forms of discrimination and to educate clients on their legal responsibilities. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves politely but firmly declining to act on the client's discriminatory request, while clearly explaining the legal prohibitions against discrimination in housing in Saskatchewan. This approach upholds the principles of fair housing as mandated by the Saskatchewan Human Rights Code. By educating the client about their legal obligations and the real estate professional's ethical duties, this approach aims to resolve the situation without compromising legal compliance or ethical standards. It prioritizes adherence to the law and promotes a fair housing market. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves agreeing to the client's request and attempting to subtly steer the client towards properties that align with their discriminatory preference. This is a direct violation of the Saskatchewan Human Rights Code, which prohibits discrimination based on protected grounds, including family status and source of income, in the provision of accommodation. Such actions can lead to formal complaints and legal action. Another incorrect approach is to ignore the discriminatory nature of the request and proceed with showing properties without comment. While not actively participating in discrimination, this passive approach fails to uphold the professional's duty to ensure fair housing practices. It implicitly condones the client's discriminatory intent and misses an opportunity to educate the client and prevent potential harm. A further incorrect approach is to refuse to work with the client altogether without providing any explanation. While the professional is not obligated to facilitate discrimination, a complete refusal without explanation can be perceived as unprofessional and may not effectively address the underlying issue of the client's discriminatory beliefs. It also misses the opportunity to educate the client on fair housing laws. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying potential discriminatory requests. Upon identification, the next step is to consult relevant legislation, specifically the Saskatchewan Human Rights Code, to understand the prohibited grounds of discrimination. The professional should then communicate clearly and respectfully with the client, explaining the legal and ethical boundaries. If the client persists with discriminatory requests, the professional must be prepared to decline the engagement while maintaining professionalism and adhering to all legal and ethical obligations. Question 15. The control framework reveals that a real estate agent in Saskatchewan, eager to finalize a sale, has directly contacted a potential buyer's legal counsel without the knowledge or consent of their supervising broker. The agent believes this direct communication will expedite the process. What is the most appropriate course of action for the supervising broker? Option A. Allow the agent to continue the communication, assuming it will expedite the sale and that the agent is acting in good faith. Option B. Issue a verbal warning to the agent about the importance of following procedures, but take no further action to investigate or rectify the situation. Option C. Dismiss the agent's actions as a minor oversight, given the agent's intention to expedite the sale, and focus on other brokerage matters. Option D. Immediately instruct the agent to cease all unauthorized communication, investigate the nature and content of the communication, and determine if any Saskatchewan Real Estate Act or real estate regulations have been violated, taking appropriate corrective and educational measures. The correct answer is D. Immediately instruct the agent to cease all unauthorized communication, investigate the nature and content of the communication, and determine if any Saskatchewan Real Estate Act or real estate regulations have been violated, taking appropriate corrective and educational measures. Explanation. The control framework reveals the critical importance of a real estate broker's oversight in ensuring compliance with Saskatchewan's real estate regulations and ethical standards. This scenario is professionally challenging because the agent's actions, while potentially driven by a desire to close a deal, directly contravene the broker's supervisory responsibilities and could expose both the agent and the brokerage to significant legal and disciplinary repercussions. Careful judgment is required to navigate the agent's enthusiasm with the non-negotiable requirements of professional conduct. The best approach involves the broker immediately intervening to halt the unauthorized communication and then conducting a thorough review of the situation. This includes understanding the specifics of the communication, its potential impact on the transaction and the parties involved, and whether any Saskatchewan Real Estate Act or real estate regulations have been breached. The broker must then take appropriate corrective action, which may include educating the agent on proper procedures, issuing a formal warning, or implementing further training. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the breach of the broker's supervisory duty, as mandated by the Saskatchewan Real Estate Act, which places ultimate responsibility for the actions of licensed agents on the broker. It upholds the ethical obligation to ensure all transactions are conducted with integrity and in accordance with established professional standards, protecting both clients and the public. An incorrect approach would be to allow the agent to proceed with the communication, assuming it will not cause harm. This fails to acknowledge the broker's statutory duty to supervise and control the activities of their agents. It risks significant regulatory penalties under the Saskatchewan Real Estate Act for failing to maintain adequate oversight and could lead to a complaint being filed against the brokerage. Another incorrect approach would be to reprimand the agent, but take no further action to investigate or rectify the situation. While it acknowledges a problem, it neglects the broker's responsibility to ensure that the unauthorized communication is properly managed and that any potential negative consequences are mitigated. This passive stance can still result in regulatory scrutiny for insufficient supervision. A further incorrect approach would be to dismiss the agent's actions as a minor oversight without considering the potential implications for the transaction or the brokerage's reputation. This demonstrates a lack of diligence and a failure to appreciate the seriousness of violating established protocols and potentially regulatory requirements. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes immediate assessment of potential regulatory breaches, followed by decisive action to mitigate risk and ensure compliance. This involves understanding the broker's supervisory obligations under Saskatchewan law, proactively communicating expectations to agents, and conducting thorough investigations when deviations from protocol occur. The framework should emphasize a commitment to ethical conduct and the protection of client interests above all else. Question 16. Cost-benefit analysis shows that maintaining an active license and fulfilling continuing education requirements is crucial for a real estate agent's practice in Saskatchewan. Imagine a Saskatchewan real estate agent realizes they have inadvertently allowed their license to lapse due to an oversight in renewing their continuing education credits. They have a client who is eager to proceed with a significant property transaction that is time-sensitive. What is the most appropriate course of action for the agent in this situation? Option A. Proceed with the transaction as planned, assuming that a short lapse in licensing will not have significant consequences and that the renewal can be handled after the deal closes. Option B. Immediately cease all real estate activities, inform the client of the licensing issue, and contact the Saskatchewan Real Estate Authority to understand the process for reinstating their license before proceeding with any further actions on the transaction. Option C. Continue to assist the client with the transaction, assuring them that the license renewal is a minor formality and will be completed shortly, while discreetly working on fulfilling the continuing education requirements. Option D. Consult with a fellow real estate agent to find out if there are informal ways to manage the transaction without a current license, given the urgency. The correct answer is B. Immediately cease all real estate activities, inform the client of the licensing issue, and contact the Saskatchewan Real Estate Authority to understand the process for reinstating their license before proceeding with any further actions on the transaction. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a Saskatchewan real estate agent because it involves navigating the delicate balance between client needs and regulatory compliance, specifically concerning licensing and continuing education requirements. The agent must make a judgment call that could impact their ability to practice and their client's transaction. The core of the challenge lies in understanding the precise implications of holding a lapsed license and the ethical obligations that arise from such a situation. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves immediately ceasing all real estate activities and proactively addressing the licensing status. This approach is correct because the Saskatchewan Real Estate Act and its associated regulations clearly stipulate that only individuals holding a valid, current license are permitted to engage in real estate brokerage or trading. Continuing to act as an agent with a lapsed license is a direct violation of these regulations, exposing both the agent and potentially the client to significant legal and professional repercussions. The agent's primary ethical duty is to uphold the law and maintain their professional standing, which necessitates rectifying the licensing issue before undertaking any further client-related work. Incorrect approaches analysis. Continuing to assist the client with the transaction while discreetly attempting to renew the license is professionally unacceptable. This approach constitutes acting without a license, a serious breach of the Saskatchewan Real Estate Act. It undermines the integrity of the profession and exposes the agent to disciplinary action, including fines and license suspension or revocation. Furthermore, any agreements or transactions entered into during this period could be deemed void or unenforceable, jeopardizing the client's interests. Seeking advice from a colleague on how to work around the lapsed license is also professionally unacceptable. Collaboration can be beneficial. Seeking advice on circumventing regulatory requirements is unethical and potentially illegal. This approach demonstrates a disregard for the licensing framework and could lead to both individuals engaging in prohibited activities. The focus should always be on compliance, not on finding loopholes. Assuming the lapse is minor and proceeding with the transaction, while planning to renew the license at the earliest convenience, is professionally unacceptable. The Saskatchewan Real Estate Act does not provide for grace periods or exceptions for minor lapses when it comes to engaging in licensed activities. The Act requires a valid license to be in effect at the time of any real estate trading. This assumption is a dangerous misinterpretation of the law and carries the same risks as actively practicing without a license. Professional reasoning. Professionals in Saskatchewan's real estate industry must adopt a proactive and compliance-oriented decision-making framework. When faced with a potential licensing issue, the first step should always be to verify the current status of their license with the Saskatchewan Real Estate Authority. If a lapse is confirmed, all real estate-related activities must immediately cease. The next step is to consult the official regulations and contact the Saskatchewan Real Estate Authority directly to understand the specific requirements and process for reinstatement. Throughout this process, transparency with clients about the situation and its potential impact on their transaction is paramount, along with seeking legal counsel if necessary. The guiding principle must be adherence to the law and the protection of client interests through legitimate and licensed practice. Question 17. During the evaluation of a potential real estate transaction in Regina, Saskatchewan, a licensed real estate agent discovers that a buyer they have been working with expresses strong interest in a property listed by the same brokerage, where the agent also has a fiduciary duty to the seller. What is the most appropriate and ethically sound course of action for the agent to take to navigate this situation in compliance with Saskatchewan's real estate regulations? Option A. Advise the buyer to seek independent representation from another brokerage without fully explaining the agent's existing relationship with the seller or the implications of dual agency. Option B. Proceed with facilitating the transaction, assuming the buyer's interest is strong enough that they will not be disadvantaged, and address any potential conflicts only if they arise during negotiations. Option C. Continue to represent the buyer's interests exclusively in negotiations with the seller, as the agent's primary duty is to the buyer who engaged their services first. Option D. Immediately disclose the dual agency situation to both the seller and the buyer, explain the implications, and obtain written informed consent from both parties before proceeding with any further actions related to the transaction. The correct answer is D. Immediately disclose the dual agency situation to both the seller and the buyer, explain the implications, and obtain written informed consent from both parties before proceeding with any further actions related to the transaction. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves a potential conflict of interest that, if mishandled, could violate the Saskatchewan Real Estate Act and its associated regulations, as well as the ethical obligations of a real estate professional. The core challenge lies in balancing the fiduciary duties owed to both the seller and the buyer when representing both parties in the same transaction. Careful judgment is required to ensure transparency, informed consent, and fair dealing for all parties involved. The best professional approach involves immediately recognizing the inherent conflict and proactively addressing it by disclosing the dual agency situation to both the seller and the buyer. This disclosure must be comprehensive, explaining the implications of dual agency, including the limitations on the agent's ability to advocate exclusively for either party's best interests. Obtaining written informed consent from both parties to proceed under a dual agency agreement is paramount. This approach is correct because it aligns with the Saskatchewan Real Estate Act's requirements for disclosure and consent in agency relationships, particularly when a conflict of interest arises. It upholds the ethical principles of honesty, integrity, and fair representation by ensuring all parties are fully aware of the agent's role and limitations. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the transaction without fully disclosing the dual agency to both parties, hoping to manage the situation discreetly. This failure to disclose violates the Saskatchewan Real Estate Act's mandate for transparency and informed consent, potentially leading to a breach of fiduciary duty and professional misconduct. Another incorrect approach would be to prioritize the interests of one party over the other once dual agency is established, even if consent was obtained. This action directly contravenes the agent's obligation to act in the best interests of both parties to the extent possible within the constraints of dual agency and would be a clear ethical and regulatory violation. Finally, attempting to avoid the dual agency by suggesting one party seek independent representation without a full and frank discussion about the implications of the agent's continued involvement would also be professionally unsound, as it might not fully address the initial conflict or ensure all parties understand the agent's position. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying potential conflicts of interest as early as possible. Upon identification, the immediate step should be to consult the relevant sections of the Saskatchewan Real Estate Act and the Professional Code of Conduct. The next step is to communicate openly and honestly with all parties involved, explaining the nature of the conflict and the available options, including the possibility of dual agency with full disclosure and consent, or the recommendation for one party to seek independent representation. The decision should always prioritize regulatory compliance, ethical obligations, and the informed consent of all parties. Question 18. What factors should a Saskatchewan real estate professional prioritize when advising a client on investing in a real estate investment trust rate? Option A. The advertised dividend yield and projected capital appreciation of the rate, as these are the primary drivers of investor interest. Option B. The ease with which the rate units can be purchased and sold, as liquidity is the most critical factor for any investment. Option C. A comprehensive assessment of the client's financial situation, risk tolerance, and investment objectives, coupled with a detailed explanation of the rate underlying assets, management, liquidity, and potential risks, all presented within the framework of Saskatchewan's real estate and securities regulations. Option D. A general overview of the real estate market in Canada, without delving into the specifics of the particular rate or the client's personal circumstances. The correct answer is C. A comprehensive assessment of the client's financial situation, risk tolerance, and investment objectives, coupled with a detailed explanation of the rate underlying assets, management, liquidity, and potential risks, all presented within the framework of Saskatchewan's real estate and securities regulations. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a real estate professional to balance the client's immediate desire for a high-yield investment with the fiduciary duty to ensure the investment is suitable and compliant with Saskatchewan's real estate investment trust rate, regulations, and securities laws. Misrepresenting the nature or risks of a rate can lead to significant legal and ethical repercussions, including disciplinary action from regulatory bodies. The best professional approach involves thoroughly understanding the client's financial situation, risk tolerance, and investment objectives, and then providing a comprehensive overview of the specific rate characteristics, including its underlying assets, management structure, liquidity, and potential risks, all within the context of Saskatchewan's regulatory framework for real estate investments. This approach prioritizes informed consent and client protection, aligning with the principles of due diligence and ethical conduct expected of real estate professionals under Saskatchewan law. It ensures that the client makes an educated decision based on accurate and complete information, rather than solely on the projected returns. An approach that focuses solely on the advertised yield without a detailed discussion of the rate underlying structure, liquidity, and associated risks is professionally unacceptable. This failure to disclose material information violates the duty of care owed to the client and potentially contravenes Saskatchewan's securities legislation, which governs the offering and sale of investment products like rate. Similarly, recommending a rate without assessing the client's suitability for such an investment, particularly if it involves illiquid assets or significant market volatility, constitutes a breach of fiduciary duty and regulatory requirements. Finally, presenting the rate as a guaranteed high-return, low-risk investment, without acknowledging the inherent uncertainties and potential for capital loss, is misleading and unethical, violating principles of fair dealing and honest representation. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a comprehensive client needs assessment. This should be followed by a thorough due diligence process on the investment product itself, including understanding its regulatory compliance within Saskatchewan. The professional must then clearly and transparently communicate the nature of the investment, its potential benefits, and its associated risks to the client, ensuring the client fully understands before making any commitment. Question 19. Operational review demonstrates that a prospective buyer in Saskatchewan has obtained a mortgage pre-approval, but the agent has concerns about the buyer's ability to secure final mortgage approval due to the pre-approval being from a less established lender and the buyer mentioning potential fluctuations in their income. Which approach best mitigates the risk of a failed transaction and protects the buyer's interests? Option A. Advise the buyer to consult with an independent mortgage broker or their chosen lender to thoroughly review the pre-approval and their overall financial situation to confirm their borrowing capacity and the likelihood of final approval. Option B. Suggest the buyer explore alternative financing options, such as a personal loan from a friend, to bridge any potential gaps in mortgage funding, without recommending they seek legal or financial advice on these alternatives. Option C. Encourage the buyer to proceed with the offer, assuring them that the pre-approval is generally sufficient and that the agent can help navigate any minor issues that may arise. Option D. Reassure the buyer that their pre-approval is strong and that the agent will personally vouch for their financial stability to the lender if any concerns are raised during the final approval process. Correct answer is A. Advise the buyer to consult with an independent mortgage broker or their chosen lender to thoroughly review the pre-approval and their overall financial situation to confirm their borrowing capacity and the likelihood of final approval. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a real estate agent in Saskatchewan to balance their fiduciary duty to their client with the need to identify and mitigate potential financial risks associated with a buyer's financing. Overlooking or downplaying financing concerns can lead to a failed transaction, potential legal repercussions, and damage to the agent's reputation. The agent must act with diligence and integrity, ensuring the buyer understands the implications of their financing arrangements without overstepping professional boundaries or providing financial advice they are not qualified to give. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves the agent facilitating the buyer's engagement with qualified financial professionals. This approach is correct because it upholds the agent's duty of care by ensuring the buyer receives expert advice on their financing capabilities and the associated risks. The Saskatchewan Real Estate Act and its associated regulations, along with the ethical guidelines of the Association of Saskatchewan Realtors Registered, mandate that agents act in the best interests of their clients and not provide advice outside their expertise. By encouraging the buyer to consult with a mortgage broker or lender, the agent ensures that the buyer's financial situation is thoroughly assessed by a professional, thereby mitigating the risk of the transaction failing due to financing issues and protecting the buyer from potential financial hardship. This aligns with the principle of ensuring all conditions of an offer are met in a responsible and informed manner. Incorrect approach is analysis. Encouraging the buyer to proceed with the purchase based solely on their stated confidence in securing financing, without verifying the pre-approval strength or encouraging professional consultation, is professionally unacceptable. This approach fails to adequately assess the buyer's financial capacity and ignores the agent's responsibility to ensure the buyer is making an informed decision, potentially violating the duty of care and diligence required by Saskatchewan real estate law. Suggesting the buyer obtain a personal loan from a friend or family member to cover any potential shortfall in mortgage approval, without advising them to seek independent legal and financial counsel regarding such arrangements, is also professionally unacceptable. This action could be construed as providing financial advice outside the agent's scope of practice, and fails to ensure the buyer understands the risks and implications of such a non-traditional financing method, potentially leading to significant financial distress for the buyer and liability for the agent. Advising the buyer that their pre-approval is sufficient and that the agent will handle any financing issues that arise during the closing process is professionally unacceptable. This approach demonstrates a lack of understanding of the agent's role and responsibilities. The agent is not a financial advisor or a lender and cannot handle financing issues that are beyond the buyer's confirmed capacity. This misrepresentation of capabilities and failure to ensure the buyer's financial readiness exposes both the buyer and the agent to significant risk and breaches professional conduct standards. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a risk-based approach, prioritizing the client's best interests and ensuring informed decision-making. This involves identifying potential risks early, such as financing uncertainties, and guiding the client towards appropriate professional advice. The decision-making framework should include 1. Proactive identification of potential deal breakers, like financing. 2. Understanding the limits of one's own expertise and the regulatory boundaries. 3. Facilitating access to qualified professionals, mortgage brokers, lawyers for specialized advice. 4. Documenting all advice and client decisions. 5. Maintaining clear communication and managing client expectations throughout the transaction. Question 20. Operational review demonstrates that a property in Regina, Saskatchewan, is held in joint tenancy by a married couple. The property has a market value of $500,000 and an outstanding mortgage balance of $150,000. One of the joint tenants has recently passed away. The surviving spouse is now considering selling the property. What is the net amount that would be available to the deceased's estate if the property is sold, assuming the surviving spouse is solely responsible for the mortgage? Option A, $250,000. Option B, $0. Option C, $350,000. Option D, $175,000. The correct answer is B, $0. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the potential for misinterpreting ownership structures and their implications for property division and taxation. A real estate professional in Saskatchewan must accurately assess the nature of joint ownership to advise clients correctly on their rights, responsibilities, and the financial outcomes of various transactions, such as a sale or inheritance. Failure to do so can lead to significant legal disputes, financial losses for clients, and damage to the professional's reputation. The Saskatchewan Real Estate Act and related property law principles govern these matters, requiring a precise understanding of how different tenancies are treated. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves recognizing that joint tenancy in Saskatchewan, by default, carries the right of survivorship. This means that upon the death of one joint tenant, their interest in the property automatically passes to the surviving joint tenant, irrespective of any will. Therefore, to determine the net proceeds available for distribution to the deceased's estate, one must first account for the surviving spouse's full ownership of the property due to the right of survivorship. The deceased's estate would not directly inherit a portion of the property itself. The calculation of the deceased's estate value would then focus on other assets. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that the deceased's estate is entitled to 50% of the property's value as if it were a tenancy in common. This fails to acknowledge the defining characteristic of joint tenancy, the right of survivorship. In Saskatchewan, property law dictates that the surviving joint tenant, inherit the deceased's interest. This approach would lead to an incorrect calculation of the estate's assets and potentially a misrepresentation of the deceased's beneficiary's entitlements. Another incorrect approach is to calculate 50% of the property's net sale proceeds and deduct the mortgage balance from that 50%. This is flawed because the surviving spouse, as the sole owner post-death, is responsible for the entire mortgage. The deceased estate has no direct claim to a portion of the property's equity that would be subject to a partial mortgage payment from the estate. A further incorrect approach is to simply divide the total net sale proceeds by 2 and consider that the deceased estate's share, without considering the mortgage. This ignores the fact that the surviving spouse is solely responsible for the mortgage, and that the property's equity is determined after deducting the full mortgage amount. It also fundamentally misunderstands the survivorship aspect of joint tenancy. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic approach to ownership analysis. First, identify the type of ownership registered on title. Second, understand the legal implications of that ownership type under Saskatchewan law, particularly concerning rights of survivorship, inheritance, and liability. Third, when dealing with a deceased owner, confirm the implications of their passing on the property's title and the distribution of assets. Always refer to the Saskatchewan Land Titles Act and relevant case law for definitive guidance. In cases of doubt, seeking legal counsel is paramount to ensure accurate advice and protect both the client and the professional from liability.